Picture this. The year is 1152 and King Stephen's soldiers are dragging a 5-year-old boy toward a massive wooden catapult. They are not playing a game. The king orders his men to load the screaming child into the sling, ready to launch him into the stone walls of Newbury Castle. We usually picture medieval knights as noble aristocrats born into luxury, but the terrifying reality is this boy was treated as literal human ammunition by his own flesh and blood. The boy's father, John le Marshal, stood safely behind those castle walls. When the king threatened to execute the boy, John just laughed. He yelled back that he did not care, because he still possessed the hammer and anvils to forge much better sons. That brutal betrayal snapped something in the child's mind, cementing a lifelong, chilling realization that nobody will protect you unless you make yourself indispensable. The oldest surviving biographical manuscript of the era, the history of William Marshal, documents this exact standoff. So how does a 5-year-old kid, seconds away from being splattered against a fortress, survive to become the greatest knight in history? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. King Stephen blinked first. He saw the kid playing with a soldier's spear and abruptly cancelled the execution. William lived, but his nightmare was just starting. As the 4th son in a 12th century noble family, William was a primary victim of primogeniture laws. The oldest brother got the castle, the land, and the gold. Younger brothers got the door. Imagine turning 18 today. Your parents hand their entire net worth to your older sibling, and you get kicked out onto the street with $0 and a pat on the back. William had no inheritance, and no powerful last name to shield him. Sent to Normandy to train as a squire, he faced brutal economic realities. A knight's gear required staggering capital. A trained medieval destrier, the primary warhorse, cost the modern equivalent of a heavily armoured military vehicle, easily soaring past $100,000 today. Add the chainmail, the swords, and the squires needed to maintain them, and you're looking at massive financial debt. William had absolutely nothing. He had to finance his own rise through extreme calculated violence. He spent his teenage years mastering the medieval equivalent of mixed martial arts, learning to strike fast and absorb punishing blows. Honestly, think about how insane that pressure is. One bad parry during practice, one broken bone, and his career was over before it began. He could not afford to be average. He needed cash, quickly, and swinging a wooden sword in a dusty courtyard paid exactly $0. To survive, William had to enter the most dangerous blood-soaked startup economy of the Middle Ages. Hollywood lied to you about medieval knight tournaments. There were no neatly painted fences, no polite ladies dropping handkerchiefs, and absolutely no organised jousting matches. In the 1160s, the tournament circuit was a massive, chaotic free-for-all spread across miles of open countryside. Hundreds of heavily armed men rode into forests, villages, and muddy fields to beat each other senseless. The objective was entirely financial. You smash a guy off his horse, put a blade to his throat and legally steal his warhorse, his armour, and his cash ransom. This brutal arena was the ultimate startup economy for a broke, hungry younger son like William. He eventually teamed up with a knight named Roger de Gaugy, forming a highly lucrative, violent business partnership. They operated like armoured bounty hunters. Instead of charging blindly into the centre of the crushing melee, they stalked the edges of the battlefield. They watched rich aristocrats exhaust themselves swinging heavy iron weapons. Once a target was exhausted, William and Roger swooped in, overpowered the noble, and dragged him off to the ransom tent. Let us look at the raw numbers, because the logistics of this blood sport are staggering. Capturing a single high-ranking noble yielded a ransom of several hundred silver marks. In modern terms, catching one guy netted you roughly $250,000 in cold hard cash. Taking his Deerstrier warhorse added another $100,000 to your pocket. Stripping his custom-fitted chainmail added $50,000 more. The history of William Marshal proudly records that during his tournament career, William captured and ransomed over 500 knights. Honestly, this was less like a noble sporting event and more like a legally sanctioned, wildly profitable kidnapping ring. And William was the undisputed cartel boss of the battlefield. He dominated through sheer physical endurance and tactical ruthlessness. During one particularly vicious brawl, the fighting reached such extreme intensity that an opponent smashed a heavy iron mace directly into William's helmet, crushing the metal tightly around his skull. When the dust settled and the battle ended, the judges could not find their champion to hand over the prize money. They finally tracked him down to a local blacksmith shop. William was lying flat on the dirt floor with his head resting on an anvil, while the blacksmith hammered the mangled iron helmet off his trapped head. He walked away with a severe concussion, but he also walked away with the gold. He successfully transformed himself from a disposable, penniless hostage into a multi-millionaire rock star of the European combat circuit. His sheer dominance caught the attention of the highest nobility. Wealth bought him top-tier equipment, but his undeniable lethal skill bought him something much more dangerous. It dragged him directly into the terrifying political orbit of the most ruthless family on the continent. If you study Plantagenet dynasty history, you quickly realise they operated exactly like a heavily armed medieval mafia. King Henry II controlled a massive empire stretching from the Scottish borders all the way down to the Pyrenees in southern France. He was a brilliant, terrifying and paranoid ruler. His sons were ambitious vipers, constantly plotting his downfall. Into this toxic, volatile snake pit walked our newly minted tournament millionaire William Marshal. In 1170, King Henry hired William for a highly sensitive, high-risk job. He was appointed as the combat tutor and personal bodyguard to the king's eldest son, known as Henry the Young King. This prince was a walking logistical nightmare. King Henry had crowned his son as co-ruler early to secure the family succession, but he refused to give the boy any actual political power, land, or treasury access. Imagine being a teenager officially handed the title of king, but you still have to beg your paranoid father for a weekly allowance. Young Henry rebelled the only way a bored, wealthy medieval aristocrat could. He hit the tournament circuit, blowing astronomical amounts of borrowed cash to build a flashy entourage. William was essentially forced into the role of managing a highly destructive rock band on a European tour. He handled the grueling logistics of transporting dozens of massive warhorses across the English Channel. He negotiated with furious merchants when the young prince inevitably defaulted on his staggering debts. Above all, he had to physically shield the heir to the throne from getting his skull caved in during those violent, muddy melees we just talked about. Honestly, put yourself in William's steel boots for a second. You finally land the ultimate corporate security gig, protecting the CEO's son, only to realise the kid is actively trying to fund a hostile armed takeover of his father's entire empire. In 1173, the family tension finally snapped. The sons launched a massive military rebellion against King Henry. William faced a paralysing, lethal choice. Does he abandon his post and back the father, who holds the actual military power and the gold, or does he stick with the rebellious son to whom he swore a direct sacred oath of loyalty? He chose the son. William actually officially knighted the young king and spent years fighting against the father's royal forces. He navigated a deadly civil war, keeping his impulsive, spoiled boss alive against overwhelming odds. The gamble seemed to work until a microscopic bacteria destroyed his entire world. In 1183, the young king contracted dysentery and died an agonizing death within days. On his deathbed, the prince begged William to take his royal cloak to Jerusalem to fulfill a crusader vow. Suddenly, William was left standing in France, an unemployed rebel holding a dead prince's bloody cloak. He had spent the last decade directly fighting the most powerful, vengeful monarch in Europe. King Henry II now had every reason to mount William's head on a spike. King Henry II did not mount William's head on a spike. Astonishingly, the aging monarch forgave the man who had fought against him for years. Henry was desperate for battle-hardened commanders because, true to the family tradition of extreme dysfunction, His next son was now actively trying to destroy him. This son was none other than the fiercely ambitious Richard the Lionheart. By 1189, the political landscape was collapsing. King Henry was physically broken, suffering from a severe bleeding ulcer and running for his life across northern France. Richard was relentlessly hunting his own father down, heavily backed by the French military. The logistical situation for the royal army was a complete catastrophe. Supply lines had evaporated, and Henry's retreating forces were abandoning critical baggage trains on the roads just to move faster. During the frantic evacuation of the burning city of Le Mans, the king desperately needed someone to hold the rearguard. Someone had to buy him enough time to escape the pursuit. William Marshal pulled his warhorse around, drew his weapons, and planted himself directly in the narrow road. He watched a small group of hostile riders tear through the thick smoke, moving dangerously far ahead of the main army. Leading the pack was Richard himself. The prince was in such a furious, bloodthirsty rush to capture his father that he had completely ignored standard military protocol. Richard was not wearing his protective chainmail. He rode wearing only a padded cloth doublet and a light iron helmet. William levelled his heavy wooden lance and kicked his horse into a full, thundering charge directly at the heir to the empire. Put yourself in that saddle for a second. This is the ultimate test of high-stakes game theory. If William strikes Richard, he commits high treason by murdering the future king, absolutely guaranteeing his own gruesome public execution. If he hesitates and lets Richard pass, he breaks his sacred oath to protect the current king. He had roughly 3 seconds to solve an impossible political equation while riding at 30 miles per hour. According to the vivid accounts in the history of William Marshal, Richard saw the armoured freight train bearing down on him and screamed in panic, swearing by the legs of God, demanding William not to strike because he was unarmoured. William shouted back that he would let the devil kill the prince, but he would only kill his horse. He dropped the tip of his lance just a fraction of an inch. The heavy steel spearhead completely bypassed Richard's torso and drove straight into the chest of the prince's expensive destrier. The massive warhorse died instantly, collapsing in a horrific tangle of limbs and throwing Richard violently into the dirt. The entire pursuit shattered. William did not dismount to finish the job, nor did he stick around to gloat. He simply rode away to rejoin the old king. He had successfully threaded an impossible needle. He neutralised a massive military threat, saved his employer's life, and technically avoided murdering the next sovereign. A few days later, King Henry II succumbed to his illness. Richard the Lionheart officially claimed the throne of England. William was now completely at the mercy of the violent young monarch he had just dumped into the mud at spear point. William walked into the royal court fully expecting to be thrown directly into a dark dungeon. Richard the Lionheart sat on the throne, now the undisputed master of the vast Angevin Empire. According to the biographical records in the history of William Marshal, Richard immediately confronted the knight about the incident on the muddy road. The new king accused William of trying to assassinate him. William did not back down. He flatly replied that if he truly wanted the prince dead, he would have driven his lance through Richard's chest, not the horse's neck. Honestly, imagine having the sheer, reckless nerve to look an absolute monarch in the eye, surrounded by his heavily armed guards, and casually remind him that you actively chose to let him live. Richard did not order an execution. He burst out laughing. The Lionheart understood a fundamental high-level military truth. You never execute the one guy who actually honours his employment contract under extreme pressure. He needed men who could not be bought or intimidated. But Richard was not the only one evaluating William's strategic worth. Behind the throne stood the most formidable political mastermind of the 12th century, his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor had just spent the last 16 years locked under strict house arrest by her late husband. Now she was completely free, acting as the ultimate matriarch and power broker while her son transitioned into power. Eleanor recognised William's raw, unshakable utility. She knew Richard was actively liquidating royal assets to fund a massively expensive multi-year military expedition to the Middle East, an event we know as the Third Crusade. They desperately needed a ruthlessly competent enforcer to stay behind in England. Someone had to protect the home front, specifically from Richard's own younger, notoriously treacherous brother, Prince John. You do not secure that kind of elite, incorruptible loyalty with a simple weekly paycheck. You secure it with monumental wealth. Eleanor and Richard arranged for William to marry a young woman named Isabel de Clare. To understand the absolute magnitude of this reward, we have to look at the medieval real estate economy. Isabel was not just a noblewoman, she was one of the wealthiest heiresses in Europe. She carried the earldom of Pembroke, which included massive, heavily fortified estates and tax revenues across Wales, England, Normandy and Ireland. In a single afternoon, William transformed from a landless military contractor into a geopolitical heavyweight. In modern corporate terms, this was exactly like a freelance private security guard suddenly being handed a controlling 50% stake in a massive multi-billion-dollar multinational conglomerate. This marriage was a masterclass in political game theory. By handing William this staggering portfolio of land and castles, Eleanor and Richard permanently tied his personal financial survival directly to the stability of their crown. If the royal government collapsed, William would lose his newly acquired empire. They successfully weaponized his loyalty. The aging warrior was now deeply entrenched in the royal establishment, but protecting that establishment meant he was about to collide head-on with the most toxic, unstable ruler in English history. Richard the Lionheart took a random crossbow bolt to the shoulder in 1199 and died an agonizing death from gangrene. The keys to the sprawling Angevin Empire were suddenly handed to his younger brother John. Let us be completely honest about this transition. King John was an absolute unmitigated disaster. He was deeply paranoid, militarily incompetent, and viciously cruel to his own inner circle. Within a few short years, John managed to lose the ancestral stronghold of Normandy to the French military. This catastrophic failure triggered a massive logistical and financial nightmare for the English nobility. If you were a baron holding vast estates in both England and Normandy, you suddenly had two different actively warring monarchs claiming tax rights over your property. To prevent his lucrative French castles from being confiscated by the enemy, William Marshal sailed across the Channel and pragmatically paid homage to the French king. King John viewed this necessary economic diplomacy as flat-out treason. The English monarch retaliated with a deeply personal, terrifying move. He demanded that William hand over his own eldest sons to the royal court as hostages to guarantee his future good behaviour. Wait, think about that for a second. Go back to 1152. William spent his own childhood trapped as a hostage, staring down the barrel of a siege catapult, treated like disposable garbage by his own father. Now, a lifetime later, an unstable, cruel tyrant was forcing him to surrender his own flesh and blood into that exact same psychological nightmare. Official records from the Royal Chancery confirm John kept those boys under heavy guard for years. William swallowed his immense rage. He handed the children over, projecting absolute calm. He understood the brutal game theory of the medieval court. You do not throw a tantrum and get your entire family executed. You outlast the tyrant. By 1215, the rest of the English barons had finally reached their breaking point. Fed up with crushing taxes and arbitrary executions, they raised massive armies and ignited a nationwide civil war. They wanted to tear the king off the throne. Here is where William made a completely baffling political decision. Despite the public humiliation and the hostage situation, the aging warrior stayed absolutely loyal to the crown. He was not protecting the abusive psychopath sitting on the throne, he was protecting the institution of the monarchy itself, which guaranteed his own vast wealth and the stability of the realm. William stepped directly into the crossfire as the primary mediator between the raging king and the heavily armed rebels. He leveraged his decades of respect to drag both sides to a muddy meadow called Runnymede. King John and Magna Carta are forever linked in our history books as the foundation of modern liberty. Very few people realise that without William Marshal acting as the respected, heavily armoured diplomat forcing both sides to the table, that legendary document would never have been sealed. Unfortunately, the ink was barely dry before John completely broke the agreement, plunging England into an apocalyptic level of violence. The Magna Carta was a spectacular failure. Instead of bringing peace, it ignited a catastrophic civil war. By 1216, the rebel English barons were so utterly desperate to remove King John that they did the unthinkable. They invited a foreign power to conquer them. Prince Louis of France landed on English shores with a massive, highly trained invasion force. The logistical collapse of the English government was absolute. French troops marched straight into London, taking control of more than half the country without facing significant royal resistance. Then, in a twist of dark historical irony, the primary problem suddenly died. King John gorged himself on a massive meal of peaches and cider, contracted dysentery, and passed away in excruciating pain. He left behind a completely shattered realm and a 9-year-old boy named Henry as his only heir. The situation for the royalist faction was a catastrophic nightmare. The royal treasury was physically empty. John had famously lost the main baggage train, including an immense fortune in silver and the actual crown jewels, in a tidal swamp known as the Wash just days before his death. When the Loyalists hastily rushed to crown the young boy as King Henry III at Gloucester Cathedral, they had to use a simple gold collar belonging to his mother. The real royal crown was sitting at the bottom of a muddy estuary. The panicked barons turned to the only man in the kingdom with enough sheer military prestige to salvage the wreckage. They begged William Marshal to become regent, effectively making him the acting dictator of England. Let us look at this purely from a logical standpoint. William was roughly 70 years old. In the 13th century, surviving to 70 was practically a biological miracle. He had immense wealth, massive fortified estates, and hundreds of loyal knights. Game theory dictates that the smartest, safest move was to simply surrender to the French, protect his vast real estate portfolio, and enjoy a quiet, luxurious retirement. Taking the regency meant inheriting a bankrupt, aggressively occupied nation. If he lost the war against the French military machine, Prince Louis would absolutely execute him for treason and violently confiscate everything his family owned. According to the history of William Marshal, the old warrior physically wept when they presented him with the terrified young boy. He hesitated, fully aware of the impossible logistical odds. The papal legate, an influential political official representing the Pope, actually had to promise William immediate, total absolution from all his earthly sins to finally sweeten the deal. He accepted the burden. He famously declared to his inner circle that even if every single ally abandoned the boy king, he would carry the child on his shoulders and fight from island to island. He immediately began liquidating his own personal assets. He used his private wealth to pay the royal mercenaries and buy back the loyalty of wavering rebel barons. He was no longer just a hired bodyguard. The disposable hostage from 60 years ago was now the sole architect of England's survival, actively preparing to lead a heavily outnumbered army into one final desperate clash. In May 1217, the French forces and rebel barons heavily besieged Lincoln Castle. The fate of the entire English nation rested on a single decisive counterattack. When William gathered his heavily outnumbered royalist army, he understood exactly what he was walking into. Standard medieval combat tactics usually involved two massive armies lining up on a wide, open agricultural field. The Battle of Lincoln, 1217, was a completely different logistical nightmare. It was a vicious, claustrophobic urban brawl fought through narrow stone streets and tight alleyways. The French army held the walled city, relentlessly bombarding the loyalist garrison trapped inside the main keep. William arrived with his relief force and did not hesitate. He immediately ordered his engineers to smash right through the blocked northern gate. At this exact moment, something profoundly revealing happened. According to the vivid accounts in his official biography, the 70-year-old regent was so fiercely hyped up by the adrenaline of the impending clash that he aggressively spurred his massive destrier forward to lead the vanguard charge. He completely forgot to put his helmet on. His squires actually had to scream in sheer panic, galloping desperately after their elderly commander to forcefully hand him his heavy iron helm before he caught a stray crossbow bolt to the face. Honestly, picture your own grandfather, at 70 years old, charging headfirst into a violent mob of heavily armed mercenaries without a helmet just because he is too eager to start fighting. It is absolutely insane, but that perfectly highlights the terrifying psychology of a man who spent his entire life thriving in pure combat chaos. He crashed directly into the French lines, personally engaging in brutal close-quarters combat. During the crushing melee in the narrow streets, the French commander, the Count of Perche, was killed instantly when a royalist sword thrust perfectly penetrated the tiny eye slit of his helmet visor. The sheer physical presence of the legendary William Marshal, swinging a sword at his advanced age, completely broke the enemy's morale. The royalists violently routed the French forces, capturing hundreds of highly valuable rebel barons and effectively ending the foreign invasion. However, winning the battle immediately triggered a massive economic crisis. William now commanded an army of exhausted, heavily armed mercenaries who had just saved the country, and he had exactly 0 gold coins to pay them. How do you settle a massive military payroll when the national treasury is literally sitting at the bottom of a swamp? You let your army steal their wages. William pragmatically authorised his troops to brutally sack the city of Lincoln, stripping the local houses, churches and citizens of absolutely everything valuable. The stolen loot was so astronomically massive that historical records cynically refer to this horrifying, violent event as the Fair of Lincoln. It was a cold, vicious economic calculation required to keep his own victorious army from turning their weapons on him. Following the crushing victory at Lincoln, William still faced a massive strategic crisis. A heavily reinforced French army remained entrenched in London, and a drawn-out siege would permanently bankrupt the already shattered English economy. He executed one final, brilliant piece of geopolitical game theory. He bribed the invaders. William negotiated a massive severance package, paying Prince Louis roughly 10,000 marks to formally abandon his royal claim and sail back to France. Buying an expensive peace was infinitely cheaper and vastly safer than funding a 5-year guerrilla war. With the realm finally secured, the iron constitution of the old warrior abruptly gave out. By early 1219, the 72-year-old regent realised his physical engine was shutting down. The man who had survived countless sword strikes, brutal mace blows and the terrifying dysentery outbreaks of medieval military camps was simply dying of old age. He ordered his retainers to row his failing body up the River Thames to his quiet manor at Caversham. He knew exactly how vicious the political vacuum would become the second he stopped breathing. To protect the 10-year-old King Henry III, William officially resigned the regency, handing the boy's guardianship directly to the papal legate. He deliberately bypassed the notoriously greedy English barons. By making the Pope the ultimate protector of the child, William ensured immediate excommunication for anyone who dared to threaten the crown. Then, the man who began his career as a landless, disposable hostage had to divide his own colossal estate. He spent agonizing days dictating the transfer of heavily fortified castles, vast agricultural domains, and massive tax revenues to his 5 sons and 5 daughters. We're talking about the complete distribution of a multinational real estate monopoly. He meticulously engineered their inheritances to ensure the Marshal dynasty would continue to dominate European politics. Once the brutal financial logistics were settled, William turned his attention to a deeply personal secret he had kept hidden for over 30 years. He called his closest clerk and ordered him to retrieve 2 highly expensive, carefully folded silken cloths. He had quietly purchased them in Jerusalem decades earlier, during his pilgrimage to fulfill the dying wish of the young king. William finally revealed his ultimate exit strategy. He took the formal vows to join the Knights Templar right there on his deathbed. Honestly, there is something profoundly haunting about that level of discipline. He spent his entire adult life drenched in the extreme moral compromises required to serve volatile, abusive tyrants. Yet, he secretly carried his pristine, unblemished Templar shroud in his military baggage train the entire time, just waiting for the very end. He even asked his daughters to sing for him in his final hours, trying to orchestrate a peaceful departure after a lifetime defined by extreme violence. William Marshal took his final breath on May 14, 1219. His retainers transported his body back to the Temple Church in London, where his stone effigy still rests quietly today. You know you've achieved a staggering level of global respect when your most bitter geopolitical rival delivers your eulogy. King Philip of France, the hostile monarch whose invasion forces William had just brutally crushed, stood before his court and publicly declared William the greatest knight who had ever lived. History loves bitter irony. William spent over 6 decades shedding blood, breaking bones, and swallowing his immense pride to build an unbreakable dynasty for his family. He left behind 5 incredibly wealthy sons to carry on his legacy. Yet, within a few short decades, every single one of those sons died without producing a male heir. The monumental Marshal fortune was chopped up and scattered among his daughters' husbands. His specific family name completely vanished from the earth, but the nation he saved did not vanish. Putting together a William Marshal documentary 8 centuries later forces us to confront a highly uncomfortable truth. We love our sanitized fairy tales of shiny heroes fighting for pure, untainted virtue. William was absolutely nothing like that. He was a violently effective, ruthless pragmatist operating in an unimaginably brutal economy. He actively enabled absolute tyrants, legally authorized citywide looting, and prioritized cold game theory over romantic ideals. He's considered the greatest precisely because he mastered the chaos instead of letting it destroy him. He realized very early on, as a terrified 5-year-old staring at a siege engine, that the world owes you absolutely zero protection. He survived the reigns of 5 different kings, not by acting as a mindless, disposable weapon, but by anchoring his loyalty to the stability of the realm itself, rather than the deeply flawed men who temporarily wore the crown. He built his own armour, literally and metaphorically, and refused to let history break him. So I leave you with this question. Put yourself back on that muddy road in 1189. If you were gripping that heavy wooden lance, staring down an unarmoured Richard the Lionheart, knowing the political risks, would you have pulled the strike? Let me know your honest answer down in the comments. If you appreciated uncovering the brutal, forgotten realities behind this legend, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Check out the next historical deep dive popping up on your screen right now, and I will see you over there.